You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. Now, what follows is a relatively short interview. For over a week, I was visiting various historic sites in the Carolinas, and this trip made it difficult for me to finish my regular episode. But it did give me the opportunity to visit with a number of important sites, and one of the sites I visited was the Alamance Battleground in North Carolina. And there I met with the site manager, Nathan Schultz, who was kind enough to record this interview with me. Now, of course, Alamance is not a battle from the American Revolution. It happened in 1771, but it was an episode that I did cover in my podcast, and it was nice to get another view on this important event. While I was at the battleground, Nathan took the time to show me around the park and give his insights about the Battle of Alamance. And of course, he did take the time to sit down with me to record the short discussion that we are about to hear. Now, because this interview was done on the fly, I may have not done as much research as I usually do. You'll hear me refer to Alamance as a battlefield. The Carolinas refer to them as battlegrounds, not battlefields. I also mistakenly called it a national site. In fact, the site at Alamance is maintained by the state of North Carolina and not the federal government. Now, I'll have a few more things to say at the end of the recorded interview, but here is my discussion with Nathan Schultz of the Alamance Battleground. Hi, and thanks for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. I'm here today in North Carolina with Nathan Schultz, who is the site manager at the Alamance Battlefield Park. Nathan, thanks for joining the American Revolution.
Oh, glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about the Battle of Alamance. Now, this was a battle that took place in 1771. It's not part of the American Revolution per se, but a lot of the people who were in this event took part later in the American Revolution. So why don't you tell us first when it happened and what were the reasons why it happened?
Yeah, so the Battle of Alamance, which happens on May 16th of 1771, is the culmination of this thing called the Regulator movement in North Carolina, which started in 1765 over fundamental issues of accountable government, really local corruption, religious laws, and a whole variety of other issues, primarily by the new settlers of the Piedmont of North Carolina, kind of central North Carolina.
So the rebels in this case, and they're called the Regulators, are the people who are living on the North Carolina frontier, essentially, and they are fighting against the Eastern establishment headed by Royal Governor Tryon.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it is very East versus West in this way, but it's more significantly, it's really about class within the colony. It is the working farmers and tradespeople against and kind of protesting against kind of the lawyers and the large plantation elite in the East.
Right. So what was their gripe? What was the problem that the frontiersmen were upset about?
The Regulators are great in the way they wrote down exactly what they were mad about. They launched a significant petition campaign where they complained about currency reform. Local officials were using the Currency Act to make it so they could steal people's property because people didn't have the hard currency to pay taxes, so they would steal their property in lieu of payment. So they request currency reform. They wanted the ability to recall representatives as they felt their representatives were not accurately representing them. They wanted a more transparent government to vote for who voted for what to be posted publicly. They wanted a public auditing of the fees being charged to them, as local officials were charging double, triple, quadruple what fees for marriage license and so on were. And then on top of that, a lot of the regulators were dissenters. These are Protestants, Baptists, Quakers, folks who don't belong in any particular religious category, who were required by the laws of the time to have their marriages recognized by an Anglican clergy, when many of them didn't recognize any form of clergy. And And they wrote that down in their petitions and then said, hey, here's exactly how you solve these issues. And the government refused to solve the issues over and over and over again.
So they're suffering a lot of corruption. They're not being fairly represented by their government. Their interests aren't being represented. And government officials are literally seizing their farms, taking away their livelihood because they can't pay these, in many cases, illegal taxes. So what do they do about it after the petitions don't work?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, their petitions, their lawsuits, their elections all don't work, primarily because one of their main enemies, this guy named Edmund Fanning, who was the judge, personal friend of the governor, colonel of the militia, and their local representative and chief corrupt official. None of that works. So they finally start taking more active action. First thing they do is they stop paying taxes, which is a great way for the government to get really, 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 really mad at you. They then get so fed up in 1768, initially, a couple thousand of them assemble outside of the Hillsborough, which is the county seat of Orange County, big percentage of the central North Carolina, to demand change. The governor makes a bunch of false promises and reneges and all that. So they finally have enough in September 1770, where several hundred of them show up to the court being held by a guy named Judge Richard Henderson, and they demand their cases to be tried, government to happen. They refuse, so they attack them. They drag Edmund Fanning, other local officials, into the streets of Hillsborough, beat them up nearly to death with clubs and whips and so on. They then demand the judge to try cases, which he does under distress. And then they go down a day later to Edmund Fanning's house, and they disassemble it, which is my favorite form of protest.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is happening around the same time that we see mobs in Boston doing lots of the same things. The issue is different, but the idea of people rising up and asserting what they believe are their rights to fair and equal treatment under the government, and they're willing to use violence to get those rights, to support them.
And the regulators will even refer to in one of their petitions, they'll both request for Benjamin Franklin to represent them in London, and they make a reference to the Sons of Liberty and being like, hey, they were successful. Why can't we be successful?
Right. So Governor Tryon is not happy about any of this. What does he do to put an end to this mob violence on the frontier?
Yeah, absolutely. From Tryon's perspective, this is lawlessness, this is rebellion, this is insurrection. So he does two big things. He first orders the raising of an army, 1,000 men recruited from the North Carolina militia and a few sailors for good luck. And he also requests some military supplies from the British Army, which will be 2 3-pound cannons and a bunch of military supplies. The second thing he does, he works with the General Assembly to pass the laws to make sure everything they were about to do to suppress the Regulator movement was legal. This thing called the Johnson Riot Act, a pretty despicable law that both creates the legal framework to declare an unlawful assembly, to suppress it by any forces. It also makes people who were at the Hillsborough riot now liable for that crime. Basically, past crime is now they're liable for that. So they pass this legal framework and this military force and march their way into Orange County to suppress the movement.
So they've essentially legalized military violence on the people.
Pretty much.
There's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah, they passed the Johnson Riot Act, which will clear them for, disrupting a crowd, which is a thing that the English government has. They do it in London. They have this Riot Act legal framework. In many ways, we actually still have it today.
Well, it's actually a common phrase, I guess everybody knows.
Oh, yeah.
Reading someone the Riot Act was a literal thing that happened in this era, not just here, but all over the British Empire, where you would literally, a law official would come out, read the Riot Act to an unruly mob, and if they did not disperse, then there would be no consequences for however the government decided to put them down.
Yeah, absolutely. They also make a bunch of outlaws. So Herman Husband and James Few and James Hunter, some of these major leaders, which means they are outside the protection of the law.
Right. This is different than being a criminal.
Oh, this means that you can be shot on sight, legally executed, and all your property is now forfeit.
Right. You have zero protection under the law. You are right. Your life, liberty, and property are
all gone. That's gone. And so they march their way here. The regulators are reacting to this. They know that, this force is being sent really to suppress them or to do something violent. And they kind of start coalescing in groups. They go to one courthouse, demand change. They say, yeah, we have a meeting set up. They then eventually assemble along the Hillsborough to Salisbury Road, pretty significant road in North Carolina, where we don't exactly know why they chose exactly the spot, but they do assemble about 2,000 of them to effectively form a roadblock to finally confront the governor directly on to solve their grievances. And it tells us the day before the battle, on May 15th of 1771, while Governor Tryon's only a few miles away in camp, that what the regulators do the evening before the battle is they have a meeting and sign a petition where they are trying to negotiate with Tryon to prevent bloodshed. That is their goal.
And Tryon is not interested in negotiations. No. What happens the next day?
Tryon orders his army out, marching out. And these are, in many cases, includes the Orange County militia, who are the regulators' neighbors. We know of at least one case of brothers, the Butler brothers, on opposite ends of the battle here, William and John Butler. But
a lot of the militia are from the east, right?
A lot of them are. Yeah, the majority definitely is. And on the morning of May 16th, at about 11 o'clock, the sheriff of the county, appointed by the governor, shows up with probably a handful of people with him to this mob of 2,000 protesting farmers with the governor's letter that orders them to disperse. We have that letter. Basically, it says, you are in rebellion against His Majesty. Even though the regulators are loyalists, they're all fine with the king. You are in rebellion against His Majesty. Disperse or else it will prevent a great effusion of blood. It's a common phrase you see a lot of times brought up. The regulators aren't incensed by this. They yell and insult at the sheriff.
The sheriff's been the guy who's been stealing from them for so many years.
They really hate this guy a lot. So after he reads the riot act, about 15 minutes later, an army of 1,000 men march up and set up on the top of this hill. The regulators on this opposite end of this hill with a ravine in between. And they stand there and hurl insults at each other with no fighting for about 45 minutes.
Right, and the majority of the regulators aren't even armed. So a great many of them showed up just to basically stand in front of authority and say, we will not be moved, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, they had done this before. They did it in Hillsborough. They did it in Salisbury. They did it years before where, hey, we're going to show the power of the people in this case, and we're going to get some concessions, or we're going to intimidate the government. And we know there are Quakers who show up here. We know that guys showed up with guns, and a lot of people didn't. Some people showed up with clubs, and everybody had guns. So they all had the option to show up.
Right. They had guns. They did not bring them.
Yeah. And so, they walk up right in front of these cannons. And we have accounts of regulators bearing their chests in front of these cannons, yelling, quote, "Fire and be damned." I believe they meant that literally, and daring them to do something. And that hour, really, that constitutes that legal justification of the Riot Act passes. And of course, as all things go with history, everything gets really fuzzy after that hour lapses. We do know that a regulator prisoner named Robert Thompson tries to flee his imprisonment right before the battle starts and is shot in the back by one of Tryon's men. The sheriff goes to the regulators, gives them one final chance to surrender, to give up. The regulators refuse. And my theory, at least, is that they probably checked their watches to make sure their justification was right. And with all 8 of those cannons lined into the regulators, they opened fire on the crowd.
Well, yeah, I think Tryon wanted his own mini Culloden here. He really wanted to show the rabble that the British might and power and the authority and violence that could be imposed on people who did not submit to their authority.
I mean, this is classic British imperial strategy. I mean, gun down a mob of people, and then they later travel into their homes, execute their leaders like James Few and several others, burn their homes to the ground.
So a lot of regulators had their homes either seized or destroyed.
Yeah.
A few of them leaders were hanged after the events. And it pretty much made an end to the regulator movement, at least as a political force in the state.
Absolutely, yeah. It drives the formal association underground We know they had a breadth of papers of the organization. None of those survive. We don't know what happened to them. They were seized or pretty much all burned.
So this was a protest against British authority, and a lot of people will say this battle in 1771 was the opening shots at the American Revolution. But that's really not the case, is it?
It's not. But I think the important thing is we want it to be. It sounds like the story that leads to us, the American nation. But the simple fact is the people who fought with Tryon are the revolutionaries of North Carolina.
Right. The people who fought under the royal governor become the patriots, and many of the regulators end up becoming loyalists because there's no way they're going to be serving with the people who just shot them.
Absolutely. I mean, and the regulator interests differ greatly. I mean, they exist many ways as a separate political force in the colony in that time. Their interests are not, this grand idea of independence and all these things. They're saying, hey, what is my problem right in front of me? How much does it cost to buy a loaf of bread? How can I farm my land in peace? How much are these fees? That's what they're really interested in. It's very different than a lot of the more grander ideas of the American Revolutionary period. But I mean, these guys don't go away. They Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. It's Highlanders and Regulators who fight there, and the Revolutionaries will spend a good amount of the early Revolution trying to appease these old Regulators. Battles of Piles Defeat. There's Regulators there. Lindley Mill and Battle of House of the Horseshoe, and we do even have one Regulator who was at the Siege of Yorktown on the British side.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, yeah, it's an amazing event. It's one that's not often remembered because it's not technically part of the war, but it is an example from the era where colonists are willing to stand up and fight for their rights. The issues are different than what comes up in the American Revolution, but the idea of Americans fighting for life, liberty, and property is very much alive in the Battle of Alamance.
Yeah, I mean, the Regulators are, at the end of the day, they're fighting for something fundamental, that has existed before them and has admittedly existed well after them.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us here on the podcast. This has been a great talk. I really appreciate your time. Anybody who gets down to North Carolina, if you happen to be in the area, definitely stop by and check out Alamance National Park.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Alamance Battleground State Historic Site. Yeah.
State Historical.
You're good.
So you don't even have to worry about a government shutdown.
It's free. It's free too. You just show up.
Yeah, they'll be open anytime. But it's a great battlefield to visit. It's one that often gets overlooked, but it's definitely worth a visit. Very interesting to see. Again, thanks again for joining us on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Once again, I'd like to thank Nathan Schultz, site manager of the Alamance Battleground, for taking the time to speak with me. If you do get the chance to go, there is an amazing log cabin on the site that contains original furniture from the 18th century. That alone is a great opportunity to see how people lived at the time. A decent portion of the original battleground is also protected, so you can walk the same ground as the men who were resisting at Alamance and the men who were putting down the rebellion. It really is an interesting experience. Now, I have to admit, I only stopped at Alamance Battleground because it was on my way to Guilford Courthouse. Because the Battle of Alamance is not part of a larger war, this battleground is largely overlooked. But as I said, it is well worth visiting. After being corrected that Alamance was a battleground, not a battlefield, I did try to do a little research to see if there was a difference. Most authorities that I could find used both interchangeably. A battleground may be used a little more broadly, as a battlefield is usually limited to the location of a military conflict during a war. Since Alamance involved a fight of a less organized group and was not part of a larger war, that may be the reason why the term battleground is more appropriate here. I suppose the fact that much of the fighting took place in the woods rather than a field could be another reason, but I've seen a lot of other wooded scenes of fighting referred to as battlefields. Anyway, I thought I'd at least pass along my research on that question in case anyone else was curious. I do plan to get back to our regular episodes next week when we return to the establishment of Washington, D.C. in 1791. So I hope you'll join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.